It began with a closed-door palace meeting so secretive that even senior aides were ordered to leave their phones outside. But when Princess Catherine emerged from the room, pale, trembling, and refusing to answer a single question, royal insiders knew something catastrophic had surfaced. Within hours, whispers spread across Kensington Palace that Queen Camilla's name had been tied to evidence so explosive it threatened the balance of the monarchy itself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, palace officials attempted to dismiss the growing tension as nothing more than another exhausting week inside an institution already battered by illness, succession anxieties, and endless public scrutiny. But those familiar with the private rhythms of royal life immediately sensed that something far more dangerous was unfolding behind the carved doors of Kensington Palace. Reports suggest the emergency meeting had not even been scheduled on the official royal calendar. It was allegedly assembled in complete secrecy after confidential constitutional advisors arrived through a side entrance shortly before dusk, bypassing the usual staff channels entirely. Even longtime household aides were said to have been ordered away from sensitive corridors, as silence protocols, unlike anything seen in years, quietly descended over the estate. According to insiders whispering within senior administrative circles, Princess Catherine had been presented with a collection of confidential documents tied to Queen Camilla's expanding influence within the monarch's internal structure. Different interpretations of the meeting describe a growing concern surrounding royal titles, succession protections, and what some advisors allegedly viewed as dangerous interference with long-standing institutional boundaries. While no official confirmation has emerged, palace administrative streams ranging from security staff leaks to whispered treasury concerns began pointing toward one chilling possibility. The future stability of the crown itself may have suddenly been thrown into question. What truly unsettled observers, however, was Catherine's reaction. Known for her composure, discipline, and carefully measured public presence, the Princess of Wales reportedly left the meeting visibly shaken. Witnesses claim her hands trembled as she exited the private chamber, avoiding eye contact with aides waiting nearby. One palace insider later described the atmosphere as emotionally radioactive, insisting the room had fallen silent the moment Catherine stepped into the corridor. For many royal correspondents, it was the kind of behavior associated not with ordinary palace disagreements, but with moments of historic institutional rupture, the kind that once shattered the monarchy during the darkest crises of the 1990s. By that evening, the tension inside Adelaide Cottage had reportedly deepened further. Various interpretations of private staff movements suggest Prince William spent hours consoling Catherine behind closed doors, as calls between senior royal offices intensified late into the night. Sources close to the household claim William himself appeared grim and unusually withdrawn the following morning, fueling speculation that whatever had been uncovered carried consequences far beyond personal scandal. Royal commentators began quietly referencing constitutional vulnerabilities, while others hinted that discussions involving ceremonial authority and succession integrity had suddenly become unavoidable topics at the highest levels of the institution. Then came the phrase that truly sent shockwaves through palace circles: council intervention. At first, it surfaced only in fragmented whispers among aides and correspondents with ties to Buckingham Palace administration. But within days, the expression began appearing more frequently in conversations tied to royal protocol experts and constitutional historians. Insiders familiar with the monarchy's internal machinery suggest such language is almost never used casually. It implies escalation, it implies crisis management, and, most dangerously of all, it implies that senior figures within the royal establishment may already have been preparing for unprecedented action. Suddenly, the carefully maintained calm surrounding Queen Camilla began to fracture under the weight of mounting suspicion. Senior royal correspondents who had remained silent for weeks started hinting that something was off inside the monarchy long before the public sensed it. The unusual reshuffling of meetings, the tightening of palace communications, the visible strain etched across senior household staff. All of it now appeared connected to a hidden conflict growing rapidly beneath the surface of royal life. And as more whispers emerged surrounding confidential files and buried constitutional concerns, one terrifying realization slowly began taking hold inside the palace walls. This was no longer simply about private tensions within the family. Something much larger was beginning to move. But the deeper investigators looked into the hidden files, the clearer it became that this was never just a private family dispute. It was a battle over the future legitimacy of the crown itself. For years, Queen Camilla carefully cultivated the image of a stabilizing royal consort. Yet behind the polished smiles and state banquets, insiders now claim a network of confidential arrangements had quietly expanded around the Parker Bowles circle, far beyond what many senior royals allegedly understood at the time. In the days following Catherine's alarming discovery, the atmosphere inside the royal institution reportedly shifted from concern to outright suspicion. What had initially been dismissed as vague constitutional anxiety was now evolving into something far more dangerous. According to whispers emerging from palace administrative corridors, confidential files tied to ceremonial privileges, patronage influence, and private financial structures had begun surfacing during a broader internal review. Sources close to senior aides claim some of the documents referenced arrangements connected not directly to the crown itself, but to individuals orbiting within Camilla's personal sphere of influence. And while none of the material has ever been publicly confirmed, the reaction inside royal circles was said to be immediate and deeply unsettling. For years, the monarchy had relied on fragile internal balance. Ever since the turbulent aftermath of the Diana era, senior members of the institution reportedly worked tirelessly to project stability at all costs. Camilla's gradual rise from controversial outsider to queen consort had been carefully managed through decades of calculated public rehabilitation. But insiders now suggest that beneath the carefully constructed image of loyalty and duty, tensions surrounding the Parker Bowles network never truly disappeared. Instead, they allegedly evolved quietly behind palace walls, hidden beneath layers of ceremony, diplomacy, and strategic silence. Reports suggest the most troubling discoveries centered around confidential correspondence involving titles, patronages, and ceremonial positioning connected to individuals close to Camilla. Various interpretations of the files describe discussions surrounding expanded visibility, future royal proximity, and influence over institutional access points traditionally governed by strict precedent. To outsiders, such matters may appear symbolic, but within the monarchy, symbols are power. Titles determine hierarchy, patronages create legitimacy, access creates influence. And according to several royal historians now commenting privately on the unfolding crisis, even small deviations from protocol can trigger devastating long-term consequences for succession stability. What deeply alarmed Prince William, according to palace insiders, was the belief that these arrangements allegedly disrupted what he viewed as the sacred equilibrium of the crown. Those familiar with the Prince of Wales' increasingly protective stance toward the monarchy claim William had grown deeply wary of any factional influence capable of reshaping the institution around personal loyalties rather than constitutional tradition. To him, this was reportedly not about personalities. It was about preservation of continuity, preservation of legitimacy, preservation of the monarchy itself during one of its most vulnerable modern chapters. Catherine, meanwhile, allegedly became one of the strongest voices insisting the issue could no longer remain buried behind private negotiations. Sources close to Kensington Palace suggest she viewed the revelations as a direct threat to institutional trust, a phrase now quietly echoed among constitutional advisors and royal commentators alike. Different interpretations of her position describe a growing fear that public confidence in the monarchy could fracture permanently if hidden internal maneuvering continued unchecked. And for a royal family already battling illness, generational transition, and public skepticism, the timing could not have been more catastrophic. Historians familiar with royal succession crises have reportedly begun comparing the tension to some of the monarchy's darkest historical periods. References to Edward VI's internal abdication fears and the power struggles surrounding previous consorts have quietly resurfaced in elite royal commentary circles. Palace legal teams, according to insiders, allegedly started reviewing historical letters patent and dormant title conventions rarely discussed outside constitutional law. The mere fact such reviews were taking place reportedly sent shockwaves through senior households. Because within the British monarchy, legal review is rarely symbolic, it is preparation. At the center of it all stood King Charles himself, isolated, exhausted, and increasingly trapped between private devotion and public duty. Reports suggest the king struggled emotionally as pressure intensified from both sides of the institution. On one side stood Camilla, the woman who had spent decades beside him through scandal, humiliation, and eventual acceptance. On the other stood the ancient machinery of the crown, now quietly demanding protection from what some insiders feared had become an expanding internal threat. And as Charles reportedly delayed decisive action, hoping the crisis might somehow fade before becoming irreversible, another force inside the monarchy had already begun moving with cold precision behind the scenes. But while Charles hesitated, another figure inside the monarchy was already preparing a far more ruthless response. When Princess Anne finally entered the crisis talks, the atmosphere reportedly changed instantly. Courtiers who had dismissed the scandal as manageable suddenly realized the monarchy's most feared enforcer had decided to intervene. And Anne was never known for half measures. For decades, Princess Anne had cultivated a reputation unlike anyone else inside the House of Windsor. She was not the glamorous royal, she was not the media favorite, and she certainly was not interested in public sentiment or palace theatrics. What made Anne feared within royal circles was something far more dangerous: discipline. Absolute discipline. Insiders familiar with the internal machinery of the monarchy have long described her as the last true guardian of the old institutional code, a woman shaped entirely by duty, hierarchy, and ruthless administrative precision. So when reports emerged that Anne had personally inserted herself into the growing Camilla controversy, the tone inside the palace reportedly shifted from anxiety to quiet panic. According to whispers circulating among senior aides, Anne wasted little time establishing what insiders allegedly nicknamed the Iron Protocol, a confidential internal review designed to examine every layer of the crisis spreading through the monarchy. Unlike the emotional hesitation that reportedly consumed King Charles, Anne's approach was described as cold, methodical, and devastatingly efficient. Sources familiar with the review claim no department connected to ceremonial access, title administration, or patronage structures was spared scrutiny. Palace files were reopened, historical precedents were revisited. Forgotten procedural safeguards buried since the reign of Queen Elizabeth II were suddenly pulled back into active discussion. Perhaps most striking of all was the quiet return of several veteran advisors believed to have once formed part of Elizabeth II's deeply trusted inner administrative circle. Different interpretations of the palace reshuffling suggest Anne deliberately sought out figures loyal not to personalities, but to the preservation of institutional continuity itself. Many of these individuals had reportedly faded from public influence after the late Queen's death. Yet now, behind closed doors, they were quietly reappearing inside confidential consultations surrounding constitutional stability, ceremonial authority, and succession protection. To royal insiders, the message was unmistakable: the old guard had returned. As the review expanded, reports suggest Anne became increasingly convinced that the situation surrounding Camilla's network represented what she allegedly described as institutional contamination. Within royal circles, that phrase carried chilling implications. This was no longer being treated as a private disagreement or social rivalry between factions inside the family. According to palace administrative whispers, Anne reportedly believed the monarchy itself had become vulnerable to internal influence structures operating outside traditional constitutional discipline. And once Anne reached that conclusion, insiders claim she became relentless. Prince William, already deeply alarmed by the growing revelations, is said to have quietly aligned himself with Anne's efforts almost immediately. Sources close to Kensington Palace suggest a confidential partnership began forming between the heir to the throne and the monarchy's most hardened institutional enforcer, together. They allegedly coordinated private legal reviews, ceremonial audits, and internal consultations away from public attention. Those familiar with William's increasingly protective attitude toward the crown claim he viewed Anne as the only senior royal capable of navigating the crisis without emotional compromise. Catherine, meanwhile, reportedly remained central to the unfolding operation, with insiders now crediting her initial intervention as the catalyst that forced the palace to confront what many had preferred to ignore. Then came the first signs that Anne's campaign was already producing consequences behind the scenes. Royal insiders quietly began reporting unexplained freezes surrounding certain privileges connected to Camilla's wider camp. Invitations reportedly changed. Administrative approvals slowed. Ceremonial discussions were delayed without explanation. None of it was announced publicly, but within aristocratic and palace circles, the pattern was becoming impossible to miss. The machinery of royal bureaucracy had begun moving against those perceived to be connected to the growing controversy. To longtime observers of the monarchy, the developments felt hauntingly familiar. Anne had spent decades earning a reputation for brutal administrative discipline, particularly when protecting what she viewed as the integrity of the institution. Former aides, historians, and royal correspondents have often described her methods as unforgiving but effective. She did not wage war through emotion. She waged it through procedure, through audits, through protocol, through the silent weaponization of royal systems few outsiders truly understood until it was too late. And as the Iron Protocol tightened its grip behind palace walls, a terrifying realization reportedly began spreading among those closest to the crown. The crisis was no longer simply being investigated, it was being escalated. Because buried deep within forgotten archives and dormant constitutional frameworks, something far more explosive had allegedly been uncovered. Something powerful enough to alter the balance of the monarchy itself. Yet the greatest shock was still to come, because hidden within forgotten royal records was an old constitutional mechanism few believed would ever be used again. By the time the Palace Council convened under conditions of near-total secrecy, even veteran royal staff sensed history was being rewritten in real time. What began as whispers had escalated into discussions once considered unthinkable. Whether Camilla's royal standing itself could be formally challenged. Inside the monarchy, there are moments when scandal remains manageable through silence, controlled messaging, and carefully staged appearances. And then there are moments when the institution quietly realizes the crisis has grown too large to contain. According to insiders familiar with the atmosphere surrounding the emergency council discussions, this was unmistakably the latter. Senior constitutional advisors, ceremonial officials, and longtime legal consultants were allegedly summoned into confidential consultations that stretched late into the night, bypassing the ordinary structures of royal communication entirely. Even among those accustomed to palace intrigue, the scale of secrecy surrounding the meetings reportedly felt extraordinary. What deeply alarmed many within the institution was the growing realization that Catherine's discoveries had triggered something far beyond reputational concern. Sources close to administrative circles claimed the evidence presented during internal reviews was described privately as deeply destabilizing, not necessarily because of any single document, but because of what the collection of correspondence, ceremonial arrangements, and influence patterns allegedly represented when viewed together. Different interpretations of the material reportedly suggested the existence of an expanding internal power structure orbiting around Camilla's network. Some advisors feared had begun operating dangerously close to the constitutional core of the monarchy itself. As tensions escalated, palace legal teams allegedly reopened historical precedents involving royal rank, ceremonial standing, and emergency institutional authority. Reports suggest ancient letters patent, dormant succession frameworks, and forgotten constitutional mechanisms were quietly pulled from archival storage for review. To the outside world, such procedures might sound technical or symbolic, but within the royal household, the re-examination of historical precedent signals something far more serious. It means the institution is preparing for possibilities it once believed would never have to be considered again. And among those possibilities, according to several insiders whispering across London press circles, were discussions involving what advisors allegedly called temporary suspension scenarios. The phrase alone reportedly sent waves of panic through portions of the palace, because, while no official confirmation ever surfaced, constitutional historians quickly understood the terrifying implication behind such language. This was no longer merely about managing optics or silencing rumors. The monarchy was now reportedly exploring whether ceremonial distance from Camilla herself might become necessary to protect the long-term credibility of the crown. At the center of the storm stood King Charles, increasingly isolated as pressure mounted from both sides of the fractured institution. Sources familiar with the private atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace suggest the king became trapped in an impossible position. Loyalists surrounding Camilla reportedly put forth calm, restraint, and internal unity, warning that any aggressive response would ignite public humiliation and institutional chaos. But elsewhere inside the palace, particularly among figures aligned with Anne and William, the mood had reportedly hardened dramatically. To them, hesitation itself had become dangerous. Every delay allowed uncertainty to spread deeper through the monarchy's fragile foundations. Meanwhile, media leaks began intensifying at an alarming pace. Royal correspondents who had once cautiously avoided discussing internal divisions suddenly started hinting at unprecedented constitutional tensions unfolding behind palace walls. London press circles erupted with speculation surrounding emergency legal reviews, ceremonial disputes, and secret advisory meetings. Even carefully controlled royal briefings reportedly became more strained, as journalists sensed the institution was struggling to maintain its traditional united front. The silence itself became suspicious. And with every passing day, public anxiety surrounding the monarchy's future continued growing. What made the situation even more volatile was the visible emergence of palace factions. For years, the royal institution had worked tirelessly to project cohesion despite endless private tensions. But now, according to insiders, the fractures had become impossible to conceal. Some households allegedly aligned themselves firmly behind protecting Camilla from what they viewed as institutional overreach. Others quietly rallied behind William, Catherine, and Anne, believing drastic action might be necessary to preserve public trust in the crown during one of the most fragile periods of Charles's reign. The emotional atmosphere reportedly became suffocating. Fear mixed with loyalty. Duty collided with personal devotion. And beneath it all lingered one terrifying question nobody inside the palace wanted to answer aloud. If the monarchy could turn against one of its own at this level, where would it stop? As whispers spread beyond aristocratic circles and into the broader public conversation, concern over the monarchy's unity intensified rapidly. Commentators began openly questioning whether the institution could survive another prolonged internal crisis while already weakened by illness, generational transition, and collapsing public confidence. The symbolism alone was devastating. After decades spent fighting for acceptance within the royal family, Camilla now reportedly faced the horrifying possibility that the same institution she sacrificed everything to enter might ultimately decide she had become a liability too dangerous to protect. And as pressure mounted behind palace walls, Camilla herself reportedly realized the institution she fought decades to enter might now be preparing to cut her loose. The first signs of collapse were subtle: cancelled appearances, altered guest lists, missing invitations. But inside royal circles, the meaning was unmistakable. The social machinery that once elevated Camilla through the highest ranks of aristocratic Britain now appeared to be quietly turning against her. At first, the changes were almost invisible to the public eye. A reshuffled seating arrangement at a private diplomatic reception, a delayed confirmation for a ceremonial appearance that would normally have been finalized weeks in advance. Invitations quietly redirected through different offices. To outsiders, these details meant nothing. But within the monarchy's rigid social ecosystem, every adjustment carries meaning. Every omission signals movement. And according to insiders familiar with palace operations, the movement unfolding around Camilla's circle had become impossible to ignore. Reports suggest a growing number of palace staff had begun distancing themselves from figures closely associated with the Queen Consort's inner network. Some aides allegedly reduced direct communication. Others reportedly reassigned responsibilities through secondary channels, avoiding proximity to what many now feared had become a deeply volatile internal crisis. Sources close to Buckingham Palace claim the atmosphere behind closed doors had turned icy, with long-time relationships suddenly strained by suspicion, uncertainty, and fear of becoming politically exposed within the institution's escalating power struggle. What made the situation especially devastating was the speed at which the social balance surrounding Camilla reportedly began unraveling. For years, her gradual acceptance into the upper structure of royal life had depended heavily on careful alliances, elite trust, and patient rehabilitation after decades of public controversy. But now, insiders whisper that many of those once willing to defend her were quietly retreating into self-preservation. The Parker Bowles network, once viewed as increasingly secure within aristocratic society, allegedly found itself drifting toward what one royal commentator privately described as a silent exile unfolding in slow motion. That phrase soon began circulating far beyond private conversations. Royal analysts and constitutional observers increasingly used it to describe the chilling emotional atmosphere surrounding Camilla's position inside the monarchy. There were no public accusations, no dramatic confrontations, no official declarations. Instead, according to those familiar with palace culture, the punishment was unfolding through isolation, through silence, through subtle institutional withdrawal. The monarchy rarely destroys individuals loudly. It simply allows doors to close one at a time until the isolation becomes impossible to escape. Meanwhile, reports emerged suggesting several ceremonial roles tied to Camilla's broader circle had quietly shifted without formal explanation. Certain appearances were allegedly reassigned. Administrative influence reportedly narrowed. Some longtime supporters within royal structures appeared increasingly absent from sensitive discussions involving the monarchy's future direction. Though nothing was publicly acknowledged, insiders insist the internal message had become unmistakable. The institution was creating distance. At the center of the storm stood King Charles, emotionally exhausted and increasingly trapped between loyalty and survival. Sources close to the palace claim the king had become visibly drained as tensions deepened around him. Every path forward appeared catastrophic. Defending Camilla too aggressively risked intensifying the growing constitutional panic surrounding the crown, but abandoning her even partially would mean emotionally severing the relationship he had spent decades fighting to legitimize. According to insiders, Charles reportedly became quieter during internal consultations, weighed down by the terrifying realization that the institution he inherited now demanded sacrifices even he might not be willing to make. At the same time, Catherine's public image continued strengthening dramatically as more details surrounding the crisis quietly surfaced. Though she never addressed the controversy directly, insiders claim many within the institution increasingly viewed her as the figure who forced the monarchy to confront dangerous internal fractures before they spiraled beyond repair. Public sympathy reportedly surged toward the Princess of Wales, with commentators describing her as calm, disciplined, and unwavering under extraordinary pressure. To many loyalists, Catherine had become the embodiment of stability at the exact moment the monarchy appeared most vulnerable. Prince William's role also began evolving in the eyes of both palace insiders and royal observers. Reports suggest he was increasingly seen not simply as an heir protecting his family, but as a future sovereign defending the long-term credibility of the crown itself. Those close to Kensington Palace claim William believed the monarchy could survive scandal, criticism, and even personal betrayal, but not the erosion of public trust in its constitutional integrity. And standing beside him through every stage of the crisis was Princess Anne, whose influence inside the institution reportedly reached levels not seen since the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. By now, Anne's authority had become impossible to challenge. The Iron Protocol continued tightening behind palace walls, reshaping alliances, isolating vulnerabilities, and reinforcing the old institutional order with terrifying precision. Veteran courtiers allegedly began referring to her privately as the monarchy's last line of defense, a figure willing to sacrifice comfort, relationships, and even public stability if it meant preserving the crown's authority for the next generation. And as whispers surrounding potential title restrictions and ceremonial consequences grew louder, one final confrontation loomed over Buckingham Palace like an approaching storm. But even after the alleged stripping discussions began, one final confrontation remained. The moment Charles would be forced to choose between personal loyalty and the survival of the crown. For King Charles, the crisis became more than a constitutional nightmare. It became a devastating reckoning between love and legacy. Those closest to the sovereign reportedly feared the strain of the unfolding scandal was pushing the weakened monarch toward emotional collapse. For years, Charles had endured ridicule, public outrage, institutional resistance, and personal humiliation in pursuit of one thing: the right to openly stand beside Camilla without apology. That battle had consumed decades of his life. It survived the fury that followed Diana's death, the hostility of public opinion, and the relentless pressure imposed by an institution built on restraint rather than emotion. By the time Camilla was crowned beside him during the sun-drenched coronation of 2023, many believed the struggle was finally over. The woman once viewed as the monarchy's greatest scandal had become queen. But now, according to palace insiders, Charles faced the horrifying possibility that everything he sacrificed to secure her place inside the crown might begin unraveling from within the very institution he inherited. Sources familiar with the atmosphere surrounding the king describe a man increasingly torn apart by impossible choices. On one side stood Camilla, his closest companion through years of personal isolation, public attack, and royal warfare. On the other stood the monarchy itself, weakened by illness, internal division, and growing constitutional anxiety. Reports suggest Charles understood more clearly than anyone the catastrophic damage another prolonged royal crisis could inflict upon the institution during such a fragile period. But insiders claim the emotional cost of confronting Camilla's situation directly was becoming almost unbearable for the king. As pressure intensified, private meetings between Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne reportedly became more frequent and increasingly tense. According to several palace sources, discussions often stretched for hours behind closed doors, with constitutional advisors occasionally brought into consultations involving ceremonial continuity, public confidence, and long-term institutional survival. Different interpretations of the meetings suggest William remained firm in arguing that the monarchy's credibility could not survive lingering uncertainty surrounding internal influence structures. Anne, meanwhile, reportedly approached the crisis with her usual cold precision, framing the matter not as a personal dispute but as a test of institutional discipline at the highest level. Throughout the negotiations, Catherine allegedly emerged as one of the few figures capable of maintaining calm inside an increasingly fractured palace environment. Sources close to Kensington Palace suggest she remained composed but unwavering, refusing to allow emotional pressure or personal loyalties to distract from what she reportedly viewed as a deeper responsibility to protect public trust in the monarchy. Insiders claim her quiet resolve deeply affected William, reinforcing his belief that the crown's future depended not on preserving comfort, but on restoring confidence in the institution's integrity before irreversible damage was done. Outside palace walls, royal historians and commentators began drawing disturbing comparisons to some of the monarchy's darkest historical chapters. References to the abdication crisis of 1936 quietly resurfaced across elite royal discussions, with constitutional experts noting the eerie similarities between a sovereign torn by personal devotion and an institution demanding sacrifice in the name of survival. Though the circumstances were vastly different, the emotional undertones felt hauntingly familiar. Once again, the monarchy appeared trapped between human loyalty and constitutional obligation. Once again, the crown seemed to be demanding that private love bow before public duty. Reports also suggest Charles increasingly withdrew from portions of public royal life as the crisis deepened. Several appearances were allegedly shortened or quietly delegated, while insiders described the king as emotionally exhausted during internal consultations. Some palace aides reportedly feared the growing pressure surrounding the controversy was worsening both his physical strain and mental fatigue. For the first time since ascending the throne, whispers began circulating that Charles no longer appeared fully in control of the institution unfolding around him. The machinery of monarchy, once carefully balanced through his authority, now seemed to be moving according to forces larger than any individual member of the family. And at the heart of every conversation remained one devastating principle repeatedly echoed by Anne, William, and senior constitutional advisors alike. The monarchy was a sacred trust above individual relationships. According to insiders, this phrase became the emotional center of the entire crisis. The crown could survive scandal, it could survive division, but it could not survive the public belief that personal loyalties outweighed institutional accountability. That fear reportedly drove every discussion, every legal review, and every whispered consultation unfolding behind palace walls. As rumors spread that final decisions were approaching rapidly, the atmosphere across the monarchy reportedly became suffocating with anticipation. Staff moved carefully through corridors thick with uncertainty. Allies quietly repositioned themselves. Even veteran courtiers allegedly sensed that the institution stood at the edge of a moment from which there would be no return. Because somewhere behind those sealed doors, the monarchy was no longer debating possibilities. It was preparing for consequences. Then, almost overnight, the palace atmosphere changed completely, because the decision had finally been made. When the announcement finally emerged from behind palace walls, even seasoned royal correspondents struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. The woman once crowned beside the king at the sun-drenched coronation of 2023 now faced the ultimate humiliation: the removal of privileges many believed untouchable. The atmosphere across Britain reportedly changed within minutes of the first leaks reaching the press. What had existed for weeks as whispers hidden behind royal gates suddenly exploded into public view with breathtaking force. Senior correspondents interrupted scheduled broadcasts. Constitutional commentators rushed onto live television. Palace analysts who had spent decades covering royal affairs openly admitted they had never witnessed anything quite like it. Because according to insiders familiar with the confidential proceedings, the Palace Council had allegedly moved forward with emergency measures targeting ceremonial privileges connected to Camilla's royal standing. An outcome once considered politically impossible. Though official statements remained carefully restrained, sources close to the institution claimed the internal decision had been framed as a necessary act of constitutional preservation rather than personal punishment. Different interpretations of the council discussions suggest senior figures argued the monarchy could no longer afford the perception of instability surrounding unresolved questions tied to influence, patronage structures, and institutional accountability. For loyalists aligned with William and Anne, the issue had evolved beyond emotion. It had become a brutal calculation about survival. Almost immediately, reports began surfacing that royal staff had received urgent instructions regarding protocol adjustments tied to the fallout. Certain ceremonial references were allegedly paused. Administrative procedures quietly shifted overnight. Palace schedules reportedly underwent rapid revisions behind the scenes as aides scrambled to implement sensitive changes without triggering full-scale institutional panic. Insiders describe an atmosphere of controlled chaos spreading through Buckingham Palace, with veteran staff members stunned by the speed at which the machinery of monarchy had moved once the final decision was reached. Outside the palace, the media storm became relentless. London newspapers, global broadcasters, and royal commentators descended into non-stop analysis as speculation consumed every corner of the public conversation. Some framed the crisis as a long-overdue institutional correction. Others described it as an act of devastating internal betrayal carried out against a queen who had spent decades fighting for acceptance within the monarchy. Across headlines and television panels, one figure repeatedly emerged at the center of the unfolding narrative: Catherine. According to royal insiders, the Princess of Wales rapidly became viewed by many as the catalyst behind the exposure of the alleged constitutional concerns that triggered the crisis. Reports suggest her insistence on confronting the issue, despite mounting emotional pressure, dramatically reshaped public perception of her role within the monarchy. Commentators who once described Catherine primarily through the lens of diplomacy and composure now portrayed her as a stabilizing force willing to protect institutional integrity during one of the crown's most dangerous moments. To supporters, she represented courage under extraordinary pressure. To critics, she had become the face of a brutal internal reckoning. At the same time, Prince William and Princess Anne increasingly emerged as symbols of institutional defense inside a monarchy struggling to maintain public confidence. Sources close to palace administration claim both figures remained unwavering throughout the final stages of the confrontation, insisting the crown's credibility had to take precedence over personal relationships or emotional discomfort. Royal historians began describing the alliance between Anne and William as one of the most significant internal power consolidations seen within the monarchy in decades. A partnership forged not through affection, but through shared belief in protecting the institution at all costs. Public reaction, however, became sharply divided. Across Britain, debates erupted over whether the monarchy had demonstrated necessary discipline or crossed into unforgivable cruelty. Some viewed the alleged measures against Camilla as proof that no individual stood above the survival of the crown. Others saw a deeply human tragedy unfolding behind ceremonial language and constitutional justification. The emotional intensity surrounding the scandal only deepened as reports emerged describing Camilla herself as devastated by the speed and severity of the fallout. Insiders claim she had believed her position beside Charles was finally secure after decades of struggle. Instead, she now allegedly found herself isolated inside the very institution she had spent years trying to belong to. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the position of King Charles. According to palace sources, the king ultimately accepted the decision under immense internal pressure, despite the personal devastation it reportedly caused him. By that stage, advisors allegedly warned that resisting the council's direction risked triggering an even deeper crisis, capable of permanently destabilizing the monarchy during one of the most fragile periods of his reign. For Charles, it was not merely a political defeat, it was the collapse of a lifelong emotional battle he believed he had finally won. Then came the silence. Not the ordinary silence of royal protocol or carefully managed discretion, but something colder, heavier. The kind of silence that settles after an institution survives a violent internal fracture, but cannot yet comprehend the cost of its own survival. Behind palace walls, aides reportedly moved carefully through corridors still thick with tension. Publicly, the monarchy continued functioning. Engagements resumed, statements were issued, ceremonies continued. But insiders insist something fundamental had changed forever inside the House of Windsor. Yet, in the eerie silence that followed the palace upheaval, one haunting question remained unanswered. Had the monarchy truly saved itself, or merely exposed how fragile it had become? In the weeks after the crisis, Buckingham Palace appeared calmer on the surface. The guards still marched, the carriages still rolled through the gates. But insiders insist the monarchy that emerged from the scandal was no longer the same institution that entered it. The panic that once gripped palace corridors slowly gave way to something colder and more calculated. The emergency meetings became less frequent. The leaks to the press began drying up. Public appearances resumed with the polished precision the royal household had perfected over generations. Yet according to those familiar with the atmosphere behind the palace walls, the silence did not represent peace. It represented adjustment. The institution had survived a confrontation that many feared could spiral into a constitutional disaster, but survival came with consequences that would shape the monarchy for years to come. Perhaps no figure emerged from the crisis more transformed than Catherine. Reports suggest her standing among royal loyalists strengthened dramatically in the aftermath of the scandal, with many inside the institution viewing her not simply as the Princess of Wales, but as a stabilizing force who had protected the monarchy during one of its most dangerous modern fractures. What made Catherine's rise so remarkable was the contrast between her public demeanor and the private strength insiders now attributed to her. Throughout the ordeal, she reportedly remained calm, disciplined, and unwavering even as tensions consumed senior members of the family around her. To supporters inside the crown's old guard, she became a symbol of the monarchy's future, composed under pressure, respectful of tradition, yet willing to confront uncomfortable truths when the institution itself appeared vulnerable. At the same time, the alliance between Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly solidified into one of the most influential internal partnerships seen within the House of Windsor in decades. Royal commentators increasingly described the relationship as a defining-powered power center, shaping the monarchy's next era. William brought generational legitimacy and the future authority of the crown. Anne brought experience, institutional memory, and the ruthless discipline necessary to protect it. Together, according to palace insiders, they became the driving force behind a renewed focus on continuity, stability, and public accountability inside an institution long accused of protecting itself through silence alone. And looming over all of it was the shadow of what insiders now called the Iron Protocol. What began as a confidential internal review allegedly evolved into something far larger, a defining institutional turning point that reshaped how the monarchy handled influence, hierarchy, and constitutional vulnerability behind closed doors. Veteran courtiers reportedly described it as the moment the palace abandoned emotional hesitation in favor of survival-based governance. The old assumptions had shattered. The belief that personal relationships could remain separate from institutional consequences no longer existed. From that point forward, duty would not simply guide the monarchy. It would govern it. For King Charles, however, the emotional cost reportedly never fully faded. Sources close to the palace claim the sovereign became increasingly isolated in the months following the crisis, withdrawing deeper into ceremonial routine while allowing others to shape the institution's strategic direction. Publicly, the king continued fulfilling constitutional obligations with dignity and restraint, but insiders suggest the scandal permanently altered his relationship with the machinery of monarchy itself. The crown had survived, but it had done so by forcing Charles into the most painful compromise of his reign. In many ways, commentators argued, he no longer appeared like a monarch leading the institution with confidence. He appeared like a man carrying the emotional scars of an impossible sacrifice. Meanwhile, Camilla's remaining allies reportedly faded quietly from influence. There were no dramatic expulsions, no sweeping announcements. Instead, the withdrawal unfolded gradually through the same silent mechanisms the monarchy had always used to protect itself. Invitations slowed, access narrowed, visibility diminished. Within aristocratic circles, the once expanding Parker Bowles network allegedly became increasingly peripheral to the institution's inner structure. For some observers, it was a brutal ending to a decades-long campaign for acceptance. For others, it was the inevitable consequence of allowing personal ambition to drift too close to constitutional power. Yet, despite the emotional wreckage left behind, royal commentators increasingly framed the outcome as a restoration of something the monarchy feared it had begun losing: public trust. According to insiders, the institution emerged from the crisis with a renewed understanding that its survival depended not on protecting individuals, but on preserving continuity above all else. The crown, once again, had been reframed not as a family business driven by emotion or loyalty, but as a sacred national institution built on discipline, sacrifice, and permanence beyond any one person. And perhaps that became the true legacy of the entire ordeal, not the scandal itself. Not the whispered betrayals or constitutional panic or secret meetings hidden deep inside palace walls, but the brutal reminder that monarchy survives only when those within it accept that the institution must always come first, even when the personal cost becomes devastating. Because inside the House of Windsor, history has never truly belonged to the happiest figures. It belongs to the ones willing to endure sacrifice in silence, so the crown itself can continue standing through another generation. And somewhere within the silent corridors of Buckingham Palace, beneath portraits of queens and kings long gone, the oldest lesson of monarchy echoed once again. The crown may bend beneath scandal, betrayal, and ambition, but it survives only when duty triumphs over desire. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.